多謝晒，多謝晒。
Thank you for taking time out of your hectic schedule to come to this press conference. I understand you have a lot of questions for members outside the chamber. But of course, in this room, we're just looking at the audit report number 64, or rather the Public Accounts Committee report number 64. Now, the audit report covers 8 chapters. And out of the 8 chapters, we selected 3 for conducting hearings. First one, Buildings Department's actions on unauthorized building works. Here, our Deputy Chairman, Mr. Potze, was the lead member in this case. He will be briefing you in a moment. And then the second chapter that we chose for public hearing was the operation of the government flying service, and Mr. Leung Sing was the lead member in the hearing. The third chapter was public cooked food markets managed by the Food and Environmental Hygiene Department. The lead member was Mr. Alan Leong. Perhaps for each report, perhaps we could take one report, one chapter at a time. Otherwise, if we take 3 chapters together, it may be a bit confusing. Now, can I ask the Deputy Chairman to briefly take you through our report on this chapter and what our comments are, and then afterwards it will be Mr. Leung Sing and then Mr. Alan Leong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On unauthorized building works, before 1975 there was not a policy on UBWs. The policy only started after 1975, but then at that time there was no definition on what UBWs needed to be acted upon at once, and then the problem accrued. And then in April 2011, there was a new policy. What were not actionable UBWs became actionable UBWs because of 7 more categories were added to the list of actionable UBWs, even when there's no imminent danger or environmental nuisance. So this was a shift in the policy in 2011, and actually that's one of the main reasons why the problems become even bigger now. At the time, there was no consideration as to whether there were enough manpower to deal with the expanded scope of UBWs, and no sufficient resources were given to the department to handle these cases. That's why the problem kept accruing. And for our conclusion, we would like the administration to provide sufficient resources to the relevant authorities to deal with the UBWs. And if they could not deploy enough resources at once, they should at least review the policy to see whether there's a need to change it. So there is no need to keep expanding a list of outstanding UBW clearance. Now, because in the past 10 years, the government spent some $2.9 billion on dealing with UBWs. But then with the expanded scope, there are now more reports of UBWs. But when it comes to the clearance of UBWs, the percentage has gone down and efficiency has gone down. So that's definitely not value for money. And that's why we would like the administration to review the policy as soon as possible and consider whether there is need to redefine the scope of actionable UBWs. Perhaps I will leave time to other members on, the law enforcement problems, the undesirable situation involving clearance and so on. We allow 50 minutes for questions, and then we'll go to Mr. Leung Sing's chapter. Questions first, perhaps? On this chapter? Yes? TVB.
Could you comment on, you said that the number of cases, there was more complaints, and then there was a drop still in the handling and removal of these UBWs. And you also noted that a lot of funding was given to these departments. So what exactly happened? What was the discrepancy in terms of all this funding being given, but how come there was no action coming out of it? I mean, I know there's more cases, but at the same time, how is the money value for money?
Just now, the Honourable Paul Tse actually gave a summary. Just to give a brief rundown, that in the 10 years between 01 to 15, more than 10 years, 01 to 15, that government, as the Honourable Paul Tse said, they have actually rendered about $2.9 billion. For instance, in 2001 to 2002, the reported case were 23,947 yearly. But in the year of 2014-2015, the reported case went up to 42,127. Means that there was a growth of over 70%. In the removal of the unauthorized building works, in 2001 there was 23,000 per year approximately. No, there were 40,000 per year, 40,000 cases per year. But when it comes down to 15, the cases went down by 17,000. So you can see actually the inefficiency that despite money being given, but then of course the Honourable Chair also was pointed out that in April 2011 we have actually a new policy which embraces that the 7 actionable unauthorized building works covered all areas. So I'll let Paul to give you a further answer. Paul.
Well, I think told you the figures about the increase in funding, the number of increase in terms of the reports that were made to the authorities, and the numbers that the cases that are handled by the authorities. So I don't think I have anything to add on that basis, unless you have anything further to...
Yeah, so in terms of the inefficiency, what do you think needs to be done to make the department more efficient when it comes to handling these things? You mentioned amending the policy.
Right.
How would you amend the policy to make it more value for money in terms of unauthorized building works?
Well, for instance, the scope of the so-called UBWs may have to be redefined to make sure that we're not covering too much or excessively those that we cannot actually deal with effectively and efficiently within a reasonable time. And I think that actually sprang from what happened in 2012 when we vastly expanded the scope of the definition of UBWs, but at the same time we haven't allocated sufficient resources to deal with them. And we underestimated the difficulties of dealing with such UBWs. So I think that was a major reason why the efficiency dropped so rapidly and so evidently.
Okay, 第二條唔該係邊位？ RTHK here.
Maybe Mr. Tse, you can answer this one as well. Given the criticism you have of the buildings department for their failures, is giving them more money really going to solve the problem? Do you have confidence that with more resources they'll be able to tackle the issue, or do you think a more comprehensive review of the policy is what's needed?
I've actually mentioned both solutions. One is obviously to give them more money. Not just give them the money, but also the system. We have to improve the system as to how they tackle the dealing with the reports, as to how they deal with the question of sending out summonses, issuing summonses for those who are not complying with the notices, and also the removal orders as well. A lot of things that we have to improve along the line. But more importantly, we have to allocate sufficient resources, both in terms of money and human resources for them. And at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, we have to comprehensively review the policy as to how we should define the sort of UBWs as to those that are actionable or those with immediate danger that we have to tackle right away, as opposed to those that we can wait. And we also suggest during the hearing that perhaps we can consider other options as well, such as issuing fixed penalty summonses instead of having to deal with the sort of prosecution as an alternative. But also the question of whether we should give more exemptions when necessary, where reasonable. Those are the options that we should consider.
Okay, 第二問，唔該。
係
I have two questions. Identify yourself at commercial radio. The first question. We see that in the report, the policy was changed in 2011, and the scope has been expanded, and then the removal, the number of removal handled from 2011 to 14 has dropped by over 50%. How come that this is the case? Should somebody be held responsible, for example, the director of building or the development secretary? And on page 49, you said that the authorities have not been very proactive in implementing removal orders. But then for people, public figures having UBWs, you are dealing with these cases more swiftly. So why is that the case? One of the figures involved is CY Lang. There are a total of 60,000 outstanding removal orders, and only 15,000 removal orders have been outstanding for over 6 years, and this is a major problem. I'll defer to Mr. Paul Chia to take your other question. I think the report has all the figures. I won't repeat them here. The crust of the problem is this. We have expanded the scope of actionable UBWs, but at the same time, we're not providing the corresponding resources to deal with the increase. So if the scope has been expanded, of course, there will be more public reports. So the number on that side has increased substantially. But then our ability to cope has not been catching up with the increased number of reports. So that's why we have a greater backlog of cases. Now, as to whether it is fair, now, we know that Mr. Henry Tang has an UBW. We have taken action against it. The government has not given us a satisfactory reply. They said that they were concerned because the media and the public were very concerned about the issue, so they had to act swiftly. But then, in accordance with the prosecution policies, they have to meet with a number of tests. But in that particular case, they had not been abiding with the prescribed prosecution criteria or screening criteria. The Buildings Department had a policy, and that there were 3 criteria to be met before the enforcement actions were taken. And in that particular case, these 3 criteria were not met. As what Mr. Paul Chia explained, we weren't given a satisfactory reply. And they said that, well, they had dealt with the case only. So any other member wishing to answer that question to Ellen? Chairman? We have been made things very clear in the report. On these UBWs, the government's policy has all along been very stringent. But then they've not been, well, they've been too ambitious. In 2011, they have expanded the scope or the number of UBWs to be dealt with. But in terms of resources, manpower, there wasn't enough support. So that's what we meant by they being too ambitious. So they had, as a result, they had not been acting fairly or enforcing the law fairly. Now, for law-abiding citizens, when they receive the removal order, then they would act swiftly to clear them. But then the neighbor may be having the UBWs, say, for 80 years, and they still went unchecked. So the PAC said to the development secretary and asked him to increase the manpower and resources so that they are not just paying lip service to the policies and they're actually taking actions. However, the conclusions we draw shows that reports are made by members of the public. The removal orders are really imposed too late. And even if the removal orders are issued, nobody was there to follow up. And then if an encumbrance on the land title has to be added, then there is nobody to follow up on that as well. And if prosecution cases has to be done, the files have not been passed on to the DOJ, and no follow-up action was taken either. So that's a problem with them aiming too high and being too ambitious. Mr. Paul Chan said that he would not rule out that at an appropriate time the authorities will review the relevant policies, and that they would not be just paying lip service to their policies, and that there would not be any enforcement action. And by the way they are doing it now, people will find that the enforcement is being unfair. Oriental Daily, Leung Ka-po. In your report, it is said that the government has allocated additional funding to the Buildings Department to deal with UBW issues. But after 2011, the new policy was implemented. The numbers have dropped instead. I would like to know, why is that the case? Is it because that the scope has been expanded, and then a lot of resources have been earmarked for such to deal with such reports, and then you are left with too little resources to do prosecution? And also, the PAC has advocated whether there should be amnesty granted, and also whether a fixed penalty system should be implemented. Well, would that give the public the impression that you would be treating such illegal acts too lightly? Also, the Director of Building and the Secretary for Development, do they have to be held responsible for the lowering number of UBWs dealt with?
2001年至到2015年呢，係政府真係撥咗29億3千幾萬去俾呢個行動嘅。當係喺呢個期間裏邊呢，政府都係屋宇署咧都做咗有7個，佢想做7個大行動嘅清拆嘅。喺呢個7個裏邊咧，佢做咗4個嘅。喺4個裏邊咧，係包括有1000幾個幾棟樓喺度嘅。咁但係咧，呢啲清拆嘅唔係一朝一夕都可以做，佢係盡咗佢嘅能力去做，但係佢符合唔到佢哋嘅目標去做晒呢啲咁。咁係當係2011年，頭先阿謝議員都講得好清楚。
And then in 2011, the policy was changed suddenly, as Mr. Portier pointed out. And before 2011 April, they would only act on UBWs that pose danger or environmental hygiene nuisance. But then from April 2011, for all UBWs, they became actionable. So the workload was substantially increased. And there were more reports made to the Buildings Department. Still, they tried the best with the manpower they had. So in our report, we try to lay bare the facts. It's not about just holding anyone accountable, but rather our report is forward-looking in nature. We hope that they will increase their manpower and resources. Now, if you have a policy and you try to meet the policy objectives, if you can't, you have to find out why. Maybe it's because to do with manpower or resources. And then perhaps the policy itself is not right. Maybe it's too ambitious. It's too extensive, as Mr. Leung pointed out. So I think his answer to the question as to who should be held accountable, in our report, we just want to state all the facts. Now, they have to shoulder the responsibility, but as I said, it's all about being forward-looking. That is how they could do their job better and address the problems they face. Mr. Wong Yok Man. Now, on the way the Buildings Department handled the UBWs, in the report you can see clearly what they have done. Of course, we're not happy, we're disappointed. From the point of value for money, after April 2011, all UBWs were covered, but even before April 2011, they weren't able to cope with actionable UBWs then, and then they had a new policy, but then they didn't give any new resources. Of course, it's not going to work. You know, with education, it takes over 100 years to educate a generation, and even with removal of UBWs, I think it takes more than 100 years. So if you ask me, of course, I'm very unhappy with the way the Buildings Department handled UBWs over the years. And then some reporters asked that there's a differential treatment against the well-known figures. But we see that they just targeted Henry Tang, but not CY Leung. That's what I say. This is what I'm saying. Now, on the conclusions, how come the Development Bureau, or on the Development Bureau's role, you just say that there are not enough resources? How come you don't mention their responsibility and the way they govern? The governance, because last time the Transport and Housing Bureau was condemned severely. How come this time there's no need to condemn the Development Bureau? Now you say perhaps we could give exemption to the not so dangerous UBWs. Maybe then you give the public the impression that even if something is not right, as long as it doesn't pose danger, there's no need to deal with it. Now, whenever we write a report, we would discuss it. We try to look at the matter from a fair and impartial angle. So every report is different. Now we look at the role and the powers of the Development Bureau, how it allocates resources and how it monitors the work of the Buildings Department. The power actually rests with the Director of Buildings. And when it comes to resources allocation, of course, that's for the Development Bureau to manage. It's also is supposed to monitor the performance of the Buildings Department. Actually, we've expressed regret against the Development Bureau, but then but the policy, of course, comes from the Development Bureau. So maybe there's not enough communication between the Bureau and the department, and perhaps they didn't consider the actual situation carefully. How come they proposed this new policy in April 2011? So did they have a full picture of the actual situation? Because there are so many different types of UBWs. Some are really minor in nature, and they don't pose any danger. In 2011, all such UBWs were included as together with the dangerous UBWs, but it can't be, because UBWs could be graded by the degree of danger, because if some UBWs may not pose any danger, they don't affect the public, or they don't cause any hygiene nuisance, maybe then we could educate people what they should do instead. Mr. Jie? Now, in 2011, they changed the definition, so a lot more UBWs needed to be dealt with. At the time, there was also the stock-taking exercise. They covered 870,000 UBWs, some 96%. That means over 1.79 million cases could be dealt with by the minor works validation scheme. They could go through validation. And then there are another 120,000 UBWs which could be validated under the signboard's validation scheme. But then the response rate was low. Why? One of the reasons had to do with enforcement, because over a long time there's not been any effective enforcement. Either no removal orders were issued, or removal orders were not followed up on, and so on. But still, actually, by law, the government could actually remove the UBWs and then pursue reimbursement from the owners. But then the government did not do that. That's why there's such a backlog of cases and outstanding removal orders. Now, I'm in support of an exemption arrangement, because it's like when in the 60s when we dealt with massive corruption, for historical reasons, we couldn't address the problem in one go. So it's the same here. For the not dangerous UBWs, which don't pose any problem, we could exempt them. And then we could address the unfairness issue, and we could deal with these problems. Because right now the law says, even if it's a minor UBW, as long as you have not made an application, you've not submitted the plans, it's considered UBWs, and you could you may be asked to remove the UBWs, and then you submit a plan, it will be approved, and you're building the same building works again. So that's a waste of resources. So for minor UBWs, there is actually room to consider exemption. Mr. Gary Chen. Well, for the UBWs, apart from the major ones and those of imminent danger, as Mr. Portier pointed out, for the large majority of UBWs, they are actually small-scale household building works, maybe like clothes drying rack or air conditioner rack. Now, in the 2011 stock-taking exercise, some 1.8 million UBWs were identified. And then under the existing schemes of the Buildings Department, there could be a straightforward validation. And then there's no need to make the UBW figure stand at such a high number. So it's about good publicity by the Buildings Department, and then we don't need to have such a large number of UBWs. If you refer to page 51 of the report, you'll see that from 2011 to 14, under the validation scheme, only 1,300 works cases were validated compared to the 1.79 million cases. So that's a small number. So even with the Buildings Department's own validation schemes, the department has not done enough publicity, and indirectly that's led to a soar in the number of UBW cases. Okay, last question on this report, and then we move on to the next one. After 2011, is there a breakdown of the $2.9 billion? How much was allocated between 2011 and 2014 for enforcement actions by the Buildings Department? Because the figure covered the period from 2001 to 2014, 15 is their breakdown. And then you said perhaps the government could reconsider the definition and redefine these problems. Now, if you redefine the problem, are you concerned that people might criticize you for moving the goalpost? Now, this is a massive problem, so you're just trying to limit the scope so the problem becomes smaller, and people may accuse you of window dressing. Well, when a problem is there, it has to be addressed. But it takes time, resources, and capability to address problems. Problems could be large ones, small ones, or in between. Now, for UBWs before April 2011, some of the UBWs were not considered a problem. They were not included in the actionable list. They might not attract removal orders. Now all these were caught since April 2011. So we just want to take a snapshot at the timeline of April 2011. We should review the problem. Maybe instead of using the current policy to deal with these problems, could there be other means to deal with them? Because we must move with the times. The situation may have changed, and when compared to 2011, some of the buildings may have even been demolished. For example, maybe someone just extended the flower rack, the plant rack a little. Then could it be dealt with under the Household Minor Works Validation Scheme? Just now, Mr. Chen gave you a lot of information about those schemes. Now, for the $2.9 billion over a 10-year period, well, if you refer to the report, you should be able to see the breakdown figures. I won't take up time here. If you wish, you could we can give you the information afterwards. Okay, perhaps we now move on if I could just supplement whether there would be unfairness. Well, I think the unfairness is that we have a policy, but we cannot actually implement it properly, or there is undue delay. So for law-abiding citizens, they remove their UBWs, but then there are many other UBWs that remain outstanding for more than 10 years. So instead of allowing people not to abide by the law, perhaps we could come up with a compromise. So in terms of the definition of UBWs, in terms of law enforcement, in terms of handling UBWs, we could act more quickly and we could plug all the loopholes. Thank you.
Mr. Alan Leung, please supplement. What the Vice Chairman mentioned was something of great concern to us, and that may be unfairness, and some UBWs go unchecked in 10 years, and some law-abiding citizens remove their UBWs immediately upon notice. Two reporters have raised a question, and our paragraph 57A. We urge the Buildings Department to explore effective options to deal with non-compliant removal orders which are long-standing. This is our focus because there are quite a great number of reports. The policy sounds very grand, but then in actual enforcement, the situation is far from desirable. So what we want to point out is that there is a large number of long outstanding removal orders. Shouldn't you consider solutions? So the way it is written in the report is such as adopting a fixed penalty system or granting amnesty to UBWs. We haven't reached a consensus on granting amnesty within the PAC. In the hearing, the administration has indicated its stance, and I agree with their stance. And if we grant amnesty all of a sudden, then that would send a very strange message in the community, because members of the public would think that some UBWs are more acceptable than other UBWs. We haven't reached a consensus on this. So looking at the context of this paragraph, we just said that given the large number of outstanding removal orders, you should explore effective means. So this is what we want to say. So I would just want to clarify this. Let me say this again. We are not asking the administration to grant amnesty, but then in the course of the hearing, this is an idea floated for consideration by the administration. Let's move on to the next report, Mr. Leung Sing, Government Flying Service, the work of the GFS. Thank you, Chairman. This is on the operation of the GFS. This is something of lesser concern to the public. The GFS has been providing certain services. In 1993, there was the GFS Ordinance Cap 322. It is using public money, and it has to provide flying services. Well, they has a great number of jobs, including medical services, search and rescue, casualty evacuation, firefighting, aerial surveys, and even supporting the Hong Kong Police Force and other law enforcement agencies of Hong Kong in carrying out their law enforcement duties and carrying passengers as authorized by the Secretary for Security. So they have a lot of different services. In our report, we are concerned that starting from 2010 to 2014, what has happened, there are 4 areas of concern. One is the search and rescue operations. firefighting, supporting law enforcement agencies, there are certain performance pledges to be built. There are altogether 23 performance pledges, but then six performance pledges have not been met. So this is a problem with value for money. And 4 targets were consistently not met for 4 to 5 years. And the PAC notes that there are different reasons that such targets were not met, uncontrollable factors such as undesirable weather conditions and air traffic control, and also other factors. For example, change in the aircraft. Maybe the rescued sites are too far off and they're not accessible and require long flying hours. And also in the provisional field, there may be special arrangements to be made. So these are the special reasons we note them. And the PAC also urges that the GFS to review the 23 performance targets in its controlling officer's reports. In view that there are changes in the air traffic environment service demand levels, so the problem may be quite complicated. So the GFS should consider making suitable adjustments to its performance targets so as to accurately and realistically reflect different variable factors that might affect the completion of its flying missions. Well, there is a shortage of pilots, and the PAC notes and is concerned that the GFS is streamlining its recruitment exercise and is speeding up the training for junior staff, and also take on more NCSC staff who have retired. And the PAC urges the administration to do 2 things. First, the Security Bureau should review GFS position as compared to other discipline services departments in terms of organization, manpower and remuneration structures, deployment of resources, and mode of operation, so that it is adequately equipped with manpower and resources to effectively discharge its duties in rescue and search operations. Secondly, the GFS should conduct a review on its service scope and prioritize its services in view of resource constraints. It should focus on its core businesses such as search and rescue missions and life-saving services. And also consideration may be given to outsourcing services that are less critical in nature. So these are recommendations on resources. And we thank the GFS for arranging the committee to pay a visit to the airport and its headquarters. Well, I didn't participate in the visit myself. Can you talk about the purchase of the new 2 fixed wing aircrafts? Well, there has been a delay of 33 months. Well, there hasn't been a problem with the procurement. There has been a delay of 33 months, and the aircrafts are not delivered. So we are worried that it will add a heavier burden to the GFS. The 2 aircraft should be originally commissioned in March 2013, but still they were not delivered as of today. And they said that the aircraft will be commissioned by the end of this year, and which is 33 months later than the original delivery date, i.e. March 2013, as stated in the paper to FC in 2009. The existing aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft, has reached its serviceable life, which posed difficulties in maintaining their serviceability. The aircraft manufacturer said that the technical support to J14-1 will be reduced, and the total downtime of the 2 J41s had increased. And sometimes there were 2 consecutive days in which both the aircraft were not serviceable. So the mission equipment installed on the two J41s comes with has been much restrained in the use. Mr. Kenneth Leung may be more familiar with aircraft, so can I ask him to supplement? With regard to the delay of 33 months of these two fixed-wing aircraft, they come with. It's not that they such delay is with no reason. We can imagine. Let's turn to page 67 of our report. The GFS. The area covered by the Hong Kong Maritime Rescue Coordination Center extends to an area 1,300 kilometers south of Hong Kong. So we're covering other countries, an area which is not covered by countries like Vietnam and so on. So the GFS has a lot of duties, very diversified. And for these two new aircrafts, they have to install heavy digital aerial cameras at the bottom. So the aircrafts are heavier. And because of this, there are stability problems, problems with vibration. So they have to ask the suppliers to redesign cover so that there will be more stability in the flying. So we have to redesign this camera sliding cover and hence the delay for 33 months. This is undesirable, of course. We are concerned about it. The flying hours in the past few years, from 2010 to 2014, has increased from 3,200 hours to 3,800 hours, up 18%. In terms of manpower, the GFS should have a staff establishment of 229. They now only have 214 staff members. So some shifts are not fully manned. But then the GFS is providing 24-hour integrated and support services. So we're very concerned about this.
Thank Mr. Leung for the education. That shows he's actually an expert. Well, we don't criticize them because there's a delay of 33 months. We try to look at it and find out what exactly is the reason for the delay, so we want to be fair. And then we went on the site visit, we heard their explanation. Now, it's not that we don't accept the 33 months delay, but there's a reason why there's such a delay, and that's important that we get to the facts in our value for money study. And then the GFS spent $700,000 on parts. They make prepayment before delivery. That's another important point we looked at. And then eventually the supplier went out of business, but then they actually omitted to report the case. So at the end, the Hong Kong government lost about $400,000. We on that we did criticize the GFS. We're not biased in favor of the GFS. Some wrote in to say that we were harsh with the Civil Aviation Department, but then with the government flying service, we are being lenient. No, but I think where credit is due, we will give credit. But where criticism is due, we'll make criticisms as well. It's all about facts, and that's important that we look at facts. Mr. Wong Yok Man, on understarving problem. Yeah, we went on the site visit. We listened to the briefing. I think what impressed the members was the fact that there were insufficient pilots. Now here we're talking about pilots operating the fixed-wing aircrafts or the helicopters. So succession plan was a serious problem. Next to the GFS base, there was a private plane air base. And they say that if our staff walk over to the next door air base, they get paid twice, flying, rich people around. So that's a serious problem. They have a shortage of pilots. Of course, in the report, we made that clear, and we hope that they would find ways to address this issue. The PAC has said that for the essential services like the rescue services, they should be given top priority. During the colonial days, the GFS was part of the Royal Air Force. Of course, it's different. Now it's a disciplined service in terms of training, in terms of the guidelines they follow in their operation. They do more than actually just any normal discipline service. They do the work of the army, actually, but then they don't have enough resources. So that's why we hope they would review the scope of service. They should give priority to search and rescue operations, for instance, because maybe the police may also need to call in the helicopters to help pursue criminals, but then maybe the police should do their own work. Well, the government's flying service is unique in the world. The roles they perform may be performed by several different units overseas. And they also even perform some sort of military style duties. Let's say law enforcement actions in relation to threats posed by terrorists. GFS will have to help out too. They're not supposed to do it, but they have to help out. So they actually taking on far more than they could cope. And that's why they're not able to meet the performance pledge, because they have to help fight fire, they have to help save lives, they have to do aerial surveys as well. Of course, that would lead to problems in their efficiency. And so we fully appreciate the difficulties they face, and that's maybe why. That's why you say we are relatively lenient with them. Next, Ta Kung Pao. 2 questions. On the 2 new fixed-wing aircraft, there were previous reports for those models. Actually, they seem to have bought the wrong model. It should be aircraft for the rich. And so was there a fault committed in the procurement process? And you talk about outsourcing some of the flying service. Can you give some examples? Do you mean they shouldn't be taking officials on familiarization visits, which are considered less important tasks? Going back to the aircraft model, the GFS, the model the GFS needs couldn't be supplied by any single contractor all around the world, because they have to save lives, they have to fight fire, they have to counter terrorist attack. This so-called aircraft for the rich is because the company Bombardier supplies aircrafts to the rich. So that's why a lot of modifications have to be done. For example, if they go on a firefighting mission, they have to refit the aircraft with several hundred pounds of equipment before they could fly. So we don't believe they have bought the wrong model. I don't think that accusation stands. And Paul can take the other question. Now, on outsourcing services, what kind? For example, aerial surveys. Perhaps that could be taken up by private companies. And, ferrying officials or VIPs on familiarization visits. Well, we did find out about that. The conclusion we came to is that because pilots have to clock up enough flying hours, that's a stringent requirement. So maybe the crews have to fly the craft with nobody in it. And so sometimes if they take, say, grassroots people to go on a familiarization visit, yes, we could do it, while at the same time the pilots are being trained. So we do not believe that it's abuse of the resources or their flying time, but rather it will allow them to do more while they have to clock up enough flying hours in any case. Other questions? For the whole report, the conclusion is that they don't have enough staff, so they are not able to meet the pledge, and so you are rather understanding. But what about not being able to get a discount, or they spend money without getting the parts? Has that also to do with problem of not enough staff, or is it just maladministration? How come you just express concern? You don't even express disappointment.
Let me explain here. We didn't use the words that you referred to because our reports are very much forward-looking. What's important is that the departments learn from their mistakes. Captain Chan admitted they have made a mistake and they have done a lot to remedy the situation. And they said that they will not repeat the mistakes again in the future. What's most important is the controller has admitted the mistake and they are doing something to make up. So we are not blaming people just for the sake of blaming them. We want to be forward-looking. We want the department to be forward-looking as well. Pay first and delivery later may not breach the internal guidelines of the government, but then the GFS is obliged to make sure that the public funds are spent properly, and if the supplier goes bankrupt, the GFS must do something to lessen the loss of the government. And they have also done a review on 2 incidents, and they have issued internal guidelines to remind their staff that they should be stringently abiding by the relevant accounting standards. And also in concluding agreements with overseas companies, preventive measures should be adopted. In the event that when the suppliers go bankrupt, there are certain procedures to uphold the interest of the government. We do have a comment like that in our report. Following up on what Mr. Ng Leng Sing said, the PAC is not turning a blind eye to this. But you must understand that, well, what you said is right. The government wants the best of both worlds from the GFS. Well, it's not that we haven't made the criticism on the 2 points you mentioned. We did make criticisms, but you have to appreciate the fact that they have to operate the air fleet, and they have to procure the airplanes, and they should monitor the delivery. So their workload is really, really onerous. So I would like to take this opportunity to say that the GFS, actually the 4 trade unions of the GFS have submitted documents to the BAC telling us how they have a heavier workload, and they include Aircraft Technicians Union, Aircraft Engineers Association, Air Crewmen Officers Association, and Pilots Union. And in the public hearing, we have raised to the Security Bureau that these 4 unions have told us that they are running short of manpower, and we have the observation that there might even be a succession problem. The Secretary for Security and also the person in charge of the GFS have responded to the PAC, and they said that every now and then they would review the remuneration package and the recruitment to ensure that the drainage of staff will be minimized. We will continue to follow up, and I think it's important that the government allocate more resources to GFS. The chairman reminds me that In our on-site visit to the GFS, we have taken a look at their operations, and in fact, we've arranged for the representatives of these 4 unions to meet with BAC members, and we talk to them face to face to understand their work situation. So another question before we move on to the next section, the third part. I would like to add that I know that Mr. Kenneth Leung yesterday gave very positive comments in the form of a motion at a meeting yesterday. Okay, the last question, because we have to move on to the third part. Yes, I know this. You talked about a succession problem. Can you talk further? Is the problem very serious? How serious is it? There is a 16% of wastage of pilots. Say if we need 40 pilots, we are having only 20 pilots. So is that the case? Do you have specific figures to share with us, Mr. Ng Lang Sing? With regard to pilots, I haven't been able to retrieve the figures yet. Succession problem. During our visit, we looked at the work environment. We understood from the GFS that there were experienced pilots who would retire in a few years' time. A good manpower deployment plan will include a succession plan, and that means that there will be experienced pilots, and there will be some who are less experienced, but then they still have certain experience. Well, we were introduced to some young pilots, and they are passionate about the work in the GFS. What I meant by having a succession problem in the GFS is that after the very experienced pilots have retired, the middle ranking pilots are in shortage. They told us that they have ways to deal with the problem. Let me add, in training up a pilot so that he can discharge his duties, well, it takes 10 years training. From 2005 to 2015, 5 operational pilots have left the GFS. Well, Mayren Wong talks about changes in the market, and among them, 6 of them have worked in the GFS for over 10 years, and the wastage rate is 20%. So these are the figures that I can share with you. And it goes to show that we understand their difficulties. In respect of how they would recruit more people, the Secretary for Security has recently made a proposal and that is for the second generation of immigrants. We encourage them to return to Hong Kong to work, and we have plans to go to, say, countries in the US and the UK to recruit these second generation to join the GFS. They've got female aircraft maintenance staff and also female operational pilots as well. So this is one way of replenishing the manpower at the GFS. Let's move on to part 3, and that has to do with the management of cooked food markets by the FEHD, and the lead member is Mr. Alan Ang. I will be very brief here. Hong Kong is a gourmet paradise, and we are very concerned about whether the cooked food markets are managed properly, because it has to do with the Hong Kong's reputation as a gourmet paradise. There are now 75 cooked food markets managed by the FEHD. 11 are cooked food hawker bazaars, and 30 cooked food centers. So those in the CFHB have hawker's license, and for CFM and CFCs, they don't have, the store operators don't have a hawker's license. And the cooked food markets are separate buildings. They are not part of the public markets, but CFCs are housed within the public markets. What we are most concerned is that in the Audit Commission's report, it is said that there is a high vacancy rate in the cooked food markets, CFMs. And some cooked food markets, they are near to each other, but then only 10 or a dozen or so are in operation, I mean the stores in there. And the vacancy rate is very high. And there have not been any active measures to, say, consolidate these neighboring cooked food markets to create better synergy. Another point of concern is that whether it be the CFM, CFCs, or CFHBs, there are fire safety measures which are unsatisfactory, which are we are very concerned about. For example, in a store there may be a dozen or so LPG cylinders, and well, if they explode, then there will be a great problem. Another concern is on the air conditioning services. Well, say if we have a temperature as we have today, if there is no air conditioning, then I don't think you would like to patronize a restaurant in the market. And in collecting evidence, and Dr. Kwing Man told us that he would study on whether to improve how the environment can be improved. If the CFCs are located on the upper floor of a public market, even if air conditioning cannot be available for the lower parts, then air conditioning can still be considered to be installed for the CFC. The last thing that I want to say is that maybe you have also noticed that at the LegCo, we have two subcommittees in operation. One is on the public market, and the other one is on the subcommittee on hawker policy. These two subcommittees take micro perspective to study public market and hawker policies and how they can better serve Hong Kong people. Whether it's hawker policy or bazaar policy or public market policy, we should take a planning perspective. If you want to organize a bazaar, market, or put in place a market which meets with the residents' need, you need land, right? And we said this to Dr. Kwing Man. We said, in 2012, the FSTB has identified 17 sites which could be further developed. These sites are managed by the FEHD, and 12 of them are now used for cooked food services, and 5 are CFHB, 2 are CFM, and 5 are CFCs. And of the 5 CFHB, 3 can be vacated for planning by the Development Bureau and for further development. So PAC discussed with Dr. Ko, since you have under your control so many precious plots, then that would help you in coming up and promoting a new hawker and public market policies, because you can have this land to be exchanged with others. Dr. Ko may not be responding us in the terminology that we are using. He seems to be using some official lines, and he seemed to understand what we have said. So for these 3 public cooked food market sites, they could be handed back to the government. That would be used as a lever, so to speak, to help promote his new hawker policy.
Questions, please? No questions on cooked food? From Oriental Daily, Leung Ka-po. Just one question. Out of the 3 reports, there's this report, there are criticisms about the FEHD for their lax attitude in dealing with the vacancy rate. So should anyone be held accountable? Well, we believe this is not something you could address overnight. In the audit report and in the PAC report, it was mentioned. In 2009, report number 51 already covered these issues. Let's say there are 2 cooked food markets, just 2 streets apart. Each has just 8 to 10 stores, and then you don't care. You just leave them as they are. Of course, it's not satisfactory. And if we say it's not desirable, now I think the controlling officer should take note. And then in report number 51 that was published in February 2009, it was pointed out that the FHD should follow up on many different issues, but then there was no follow-up. For example, the rental issue, adjustments of rentals, some rentals in arrears, or government rates are not recovered, and so on. So they haven't done all these since then, and we have asked them to try to take actions. Because we will follow up on our recommendations in the report until they are all complied with. So we won't let them off the hook. If they don't comply, we will pursue them. So they're not allowed to cut any slack. Paul? I think in many members' comments, we said that now with the value for money study, we want to make sure they use resources properly. But at the same time, we have to look at those operators of cooked food markets and so on. They are just struggling to make ends meet, so we have to put people first when we deal with these cases. And so we appreciate that the department faces certain difficulties. On the one hand, it's supposed to comply with the rules and regulations, but maybe we don't want to put too much pressure to bear on the operators. Well, maybe what they're doing is not desirable, but then we won't be too strong in our condemnation, if I could put it that way. There are 27 markets. Only 22 markets are air-conditioned, and that's not desirable. But then sometimes there may be some constraints. So, for example, not enough electricity supply, so air conditioning could not be retrofitted. But then it may be the case that there is a need for such a market in the area. So that's why some of these markets remain. Although they're not air conditioned, they're still there to serve the residents in the neighborhood. So they face a lot of difficulties in running these markets, and then they have limited resources too. And they can't do away with some of these markets. So that's why we've asked Dr. Ko Wing-man to consider a new strategy to deal with markets, public markets, as well as cooked food centers as a whole. Then it will be good for the hawkers and for the local communities too. And we've actually encouraged Dr. Ko to buy back the licenses from some of the hawkers, so hawkers don't have to struggle to run a business in such poor conditions. So you can see in our report, we believe we should put people first and see how we could address these issues. Now, some of the markets are needed by the residents. We don't want to demolish all the markets so everything is run by link grid. Of course, we don't want that. So it's about striking the right balance, and we have to identify what is the right balance. And so we urge Dr. Ko Wing-man to put people first in serving the people. Well, Dr. Ko has been active in the work in the meetings of the Subcommittee on Issues Relating to Public Markets and the Subcommittee of Hawker Policy of the LegCo. Recently, at the Subcommittee on Public Markets meeting, he said that rent would be frozen till the end of this year, but it will be extended to the 30th of June 2017. And then he went through the consultancy report with us 2 or 3 times. So maybe your observation is right. Our inclination is to encourage the Secretary to be more proactive in doing better so everybody could benefit. That's generally the direction we take. No other questions? Just a straightforward question. Now, you said you could appreciate the difficulties the government face in dealing with markets, but from report number 51, those issues remain outstanding, and now we see new issues. Is it the case that when it comes to the management of public markets, there are a lot of loopholes? What explanations do they give? How come they could allow so many loopholes to be left unplugged? And do you accept their explanations? If you ask me, of course, that's not acceptable. But while we do not accept explanations, we have to understand what the problems are. Now, if you go back to report number 51, you know, some of the hawkers simply could not pay up the rent. If you force them, they would just go bankrupt. And sometimes they can't pay the electricity bill. It's not that they don't want to do it, but they face constraints, and maybe they have to end up using more resources in recovering the payment arrears. Well, this is a value for money study, so they have to explain to us why they couldn't do something that we have specified in our report. But here we are talking about serving the public. That's what they're trying to do. If you try to measure everything with money, well, sometimes it's hard to measure service with money. That is how much we should recover in running a market. We can't just look at everything from the commercial point of view. Sometimes we have to look at it as a service to the public. So what they don't achieve under report number 51, we'll tell them to review, or they could say we will waive all these fees, so they just write off the debt. Or of course, if there's still such payment outstanding, we have to keep asking them what they're doing about it. And you see, most of these are just individual hawkers who fail to pay the electricity bill or government rates and so on. Mr. Well, I think our PAC reports are becoming more mature in a way. We try to, that is, we are able to strike the right balance. Now, we know what the actual situation is, and we know sometimes the government may have difficulties doing certain things, but that doesn't mean we'll just let them off. It's not about just sympathizing with the hawkers. In our report, we said we've noted the Secretary's explanations. Now, cooked food hawker bazaar should be transient in nature. It's for reciting licensed hawkers, and these bazaars will eventually be closed. So that is the reality. And this is just a transitional arrangement, and so we have to take care of both sides. The government has to take certain actions at the same time. After they recover all the licenses, they have to redevelop those sites. And the Development Bureau would also redevelop those sites at an appropriate time. So it's about using public money properly. That's why I say this is a mature report, is in that sense. Mr. Alan Leong, the lead member, could give you the current picture. Now, I joined Lashko in 2004. Since then, I've been following up on the question of public markets, especially in relation to rentals, retrofitting of air conditioning, and so on. And as you know, the government has commissioned an expert committee on public markets, and the report's been published. And then this was discussed by the subcommittee on public markets. And Dr. Koh heard us loud and clear. He's going to freeze rent for another 18 months till the 30th of June 2017. We believe that's good because, first of all, they must improve the business environment for the store operators. They must be given a chance to make some money before you increase the rent. Otherwise, like if they do like what they did 3 years ago to increase rent, people would just leave. So we would like to give some more leeway to the Dr. Koh to deal with the issues, and we'll follow up on these matters at the reference subcommittees or the panel. Now, here we look at the issue from the point of view of value for money. And in measuring value for money, it must be fair and impartial. And we need to strike the right balance in dealing with issues. So that's why if you look at all three reports, where criticisms are due, we'll make criticisms, and where credit is due, we'll give credit. And we try to look at things from the point of view of the public as we review the audit reports, and then we try to get to the real reasons for those problems. Thank you.